Let's get straight to royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams now, who joins us. Good morning to you, Richard.
Good morning.
Well, we've been discussing all week with you these front page after front page, day after day. I think it's the sixth day in a row now where Prince Andrew is featured. Very different story today, though, with the decision that he is standing down after crisis talks with the Queen, stepping back from his royal duties. The headlines are absolutely damning. Outcast, Prince Endy and the like. How big a decision would this have been at the palace to have the Queen's second son, apparently her favourite son, step back from royal duties, possibly forever?
Oh, I think undoubtedly forever, at least for the foreseeable future, is absolutely the case with so many questions still unanswered. Oh, well, an enormous decision. The Queen and Prince Charles would have agreed it was impossible for him to continue. And I mean, it was. It had reached a point of meltdown, remembering his links to over 200 organizations. Remember also the fact that, frankly, the sharks were circling, and it was absolutely clear that he'd become an object of derision. You need some gravitas to be a royal. Heaven knows that matters have reached levels whereby he may have hoped to hang on, but it really was impossible. And it was affecting the monarchy very, very seriously. It was part of the election debate. And not flatteringly so.
Exactly, and yes, exactly. The fact that and I thought it was rather bizarre, frankly, actually, that during the ITV debate that Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson were asked about it. But you say more than 20 major companies and charities, including Barclays, KPMG, National Ballet, distanced themselves from Prince Andrew and the initiatives he'd been backing. No one's going to want this man to turn up to their event to open the new school or cut a ribbon in a new building, are they? But this, in terms of damage to the royal family as such, this isn't the annus horribilis that the Queen had with revelations of affairs and divorces and upset marriages, because look, ordinary families go through this. Every family will have a messy divorce and stories of infidelity and the like. This is very different. This is about a very senior royal, eighth in line to the throne, a former UK trade envoy, befriending at a very level of staying at his various houses and flying in his private jet, a billionaire now known during the time of that friendship to be someone who's convicted of child trafficking sex slaves, teenage girls. This is far more serious than really anything else that has engulfed the royal family in quite a few years.
Oh, there's no question about that. I mean, there are question marks also as to when Andrew knew Epstein first. This apparently is something linked to a letter published in the Times. So obviously, everything he said has been picked over. And there are so many questions it raises. And also, apart from the outrage of the victims to have been ignored in his, I can only say, a ramble with train wreck was a generous description of it. The facts are that he has expressed his willingness, as he's obviously got to cooperate with the FBI inquiry, for example, if necessary. There's an inquiry in France. Who knows? Matters may be opened here by the Metropolitan Police, reopened. The point is there are a lot of questions to be answered, and it will be a matter of urgency that he answers them. He is or has become an embarrassment from the Pizza Express in Woking to a symbol of the worst form of snobbery. The most extraordinary thing is he has appeared so totally out of touch, but it's dangerous. No monarchy can afford to be out of touch.
Well, indeed, and especially with all the bad publicity regarding hypocrisy over private jets and the environment with Prince Harry and Meghan. Just finally, we understand that the Queen also spoke with Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, who's in New Zealand at the current time, and we know that Prince Charles has talked about wanting to sort of slim down the monarchy. How influential do you think he was on this decision?
Well, obviously, it was very much the case. The Queen was isolated because if you consider what actually happened, the decision to go ahead with this, she was aware of the interview, but most certainly not of the content. And, you had a situation. Sir Christopher, now Lord Guy, who'd served her as private secretary for 10 years, stepped down 2 years ago. The Duke of Edinburgh retired 2 years ago. The Sussexes are unhappy, and there is that is to be solved, or still remains important, and that will be the next challenge. Also, with the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall in New Zealand, I mean, obviously, it was absolutely pivotal because, I mean, had rumours about a second interview, which took me, I was horror-struck. They occurred yesterday afternoon. Anything like that had occurred. I mean, you really would have had a meltdown. Clearly, crisis management at the palace needs to be urgently reassessed. And, I mean, yes, now he has stepped down. About time, because it's amazing he lasted as long as he did. But, I mean, from a point of view where you've got 6% support, you don't last long, you don't deserve to last long, and you've got a lot of questions to answer.
Indeed. Let's turn our attention back to the general election now, and let's talk to Peter Bone, who's from the Conservative Party. Good morning to you, Peter.
Good morning.
Good morning. Well, an awful lot of the election announcements have been thrown off the front pages by the Prince Andrew news. Just ask you about that first of all. Is the right decision of Prince Andrew step back from public duties, and do you think he jumped or was he pushed?
Well, I don't know.
I'm asking what you think.
I mean, he was probably right to step back. I mean, I used to chair the all-party group against human trafficking, and what we've got here, as from media reports, is young women trafficked for sexual purposes, undoubtedly by very, very evil gangs. And I wish the American authorities every success in breaking down these evil gangs, and also that the victims are being looked after properly. I know in this country we have a very good programme for victims of human trafficking, and we lead Europe on that. But these gangs are the worst of evil gangsters.
Yeah, but Jeffrey Epstein, I think it was a gang all on his own. Well, look, we've got a Labour Party manifesto launch today. That's been kicked off most of the front pages as well. And I'll talk about what the Tories are doing in just a few moments. But they're pledging £75 billion of their £150 billion social transformation fund they've already spoken about to tackle the housing crisis in the UK. They want to build 100,000 council houses a year, 50,000 social homes a year through housing associations, and basically trebling the number of houses that are built in total in this country, and upscaling from in terms of social housing by a much bigger factor. An awful lot of people who might be considering voting Conservative, particularly over the Leave issue, especially in West Midlands and northern areas, and indeed in very high price of housing areas like the South East, will find this a very alluring policy. Do you think that the Tories should be running scared of policies like this from the Labour Party?
Well, it shouldn't be running scared. I mean, what the Labour Party's doing is promising everything to everyone. It has, as I think Boris Johnson said, a forest of money trees. And the fact is, if you look back to their record when they were in office, they built very few council houses and social houses. And what would happen, of course, if you got a Labour government is they would wreck the economy. And as with every previous Labour government, unemployment would increase. There'd be more people unemployed at the end of a Labour government than before. They just can't run the economy. They're making a lot of promises to try and attract people to vote for them, but there is absolutely no chance of them delivering it.
Well, you say no chance of delivering it, but I mean, we've had bigger house building projects before in the post-war years. Undoubtedly, it is the case that we need more housing. All of the fiddling around with, Help to Buy and all of that, and all these other projects that we had under the Conservative governments of the last few years haven't actually increased the number of homes available for people, particularly those on low incomes, either to buy or to rent or to get through social housing. Isn't this exactly the sort of policy that a progressive Conservative government should be pursuing itself?
Well, the Conservative government is building more houses and will continue to do so, and it's
not on this scale.
One of the priorities, but what you have to stand back and say, who's likely actually to achieve what they're promising? And I would argue very strongly that the Conservatives have the record of setting out reasonable targets and delivering them, whereas Labour's got absolutely no chance of doing it. They would completely ruin the economy. I mean, it is being done to attract people's votes, and it sounds good, but it's not deliverable. And and the one thing, of course, none of this will happen because we will still be stuck in the European Union and arguing about that and what 2 referendums. It's just not going to happen. We have to get Brexit done and moved on. And that's a very simple choice. I mean,
Okay,
you have to decide who you believe in.
Well, let's see what the Conservatives are planning to achieve. In terms of announcements today, elderly people will no longer have to sell their houses to pay for social care, is something that Boris Johnson is going to pledge. He's announcing a £5 billion cash injection to ease the funding crisis. Said he wants to end the injustice of people having to sell their family home by seeking a cross-party agreement on how to pay for the soaring costs of caring for the elderly and disabled. Is he going to achieve that? Because it seems to me that this has been discussed by every political party for quite a few years. And we saw the dementia tax, as it was dubbed, even by some of your own colleagues on your benches in 2017 in the Tory manifesto written by Theresa May's aides, that was remarkably unpopular. But if you're not going to ask people to pay for it themselves and you're not going to charge them specific tax, you are going to just have to increase taxes across the board for everyone to pay for it. So is he going to actually achieve that aim?
Well, I hadn't heard that announcement, but it sounds extremely good. I feel very strongly about the social care situation, and I've always thought that the way to solve it is immediately after a general election, sit down with the other parties and agree on something that will last. Political parties aren't going to agree on something just before an election, but after sit down, have a proper review, decide which is the way forward, and all the problems that you highlighted have to be sorted out. And if it's cross-party, then it will stick. And that's what needs to happen. And if that's what we're planning, that's an excellent idea.
OK, well, also another announcement, which perhaps we understand was rather slipped out, perhaps not intended by Boris Johnson when he was in a meeting with factory workers yesterday. Apparently a story that was supposed to be in the Sunday newspapers, which is about his cut to national insurance, effectively by raising the threshold at which you pay national insurance to £12,500. We start paying it £12,500. This would effectively be a tax cut on average of £464 per person per year. This will be a tax cut for 31 million workers. It'll affect all but the highest earners who aren't affected by national insurance at their very top echelons. But again, this is a major policy announcement, drowned out largely by the Labour manifesto and the Prince Andrew news, slipped out by accident by the Prime Minister. It's a little bit of a mess up, isn't it?
Oh, come on now. That's unbelievable. Isn't it wonderful? You're a Prime Minister. You ask him a question and he gives a straight answer. I mean, that's what...
He'll never catch on.
It really is the way to do it. It's so refreshing. You ask Boris a question, he's got all sorts of energy, and he says what he thinks. I mean, his handlers must be horrified, but he's just what we want. Somebody who tells it as it is, and I just think it's great that we're going to cut taxes for people. I mean, and it is.
But the only thing is, he told people on a campaign visit to Stockton-on-Tees. He said we're going to be cutting national, because he was asked basically. You said you were having low tax, being a low tax economy, and one of the workers said, "You said low tax. Do you mean low tax for people like you, or low tax for people like us?" And he said, "If you look at what we're doing and what I said in the last few years, we're going to be cutting national insurance up to £12,000, and then talking about business rates and the like." Now, yesterday the Tories said that the aim was to raise the threshold to £12,500 a year, and that was their ultimate ambition. That doesn't sound like it's something that's going to be happening in the first few months of a new Tory government, does it?
They've already announced that they're going to move it up significantly in the first budget and carry on doing it in subsequent budgets. What I want to see is a government that is committed to cutting taxes year by year, and that's what we're going to do. It comes back to the old thing. Conservatives want to cut taxes and not spend so much. Labour wants to spend your money and wreck the economy. That is the annual. Every general election revolves around that question, but this general election is even more important, because the only way you're going to get Brexit done is if you get a Conservative majority government. And we can't move on until Brexit's done. So,
we hear this all the time. And again, we hear this from Leavers saying we need to get Brexit done before we can do things. And we hear from Remainers, we can't do anything, we're paralysed because everyone's just talking about Brexit. Why, if you're, say, a housing minister or if you're a transport minister or whatever, why can't you get on and do your job and make decisions because of the Brexit policy? What is stopping any government or any politician of any political hue from getting on and doing the things this country needs doing just because of Brexit, whether they're for or against it?
because you will know, and you follow it so closely, that Parliament was paralysed for at least, I would say, 9 months. Well, we could do nothing because all the argument is about Brexit. Until you've moved on and got that done,
you don't need legislation for a lot of this stuff.
Well, we what, to come out of the European? No,
you don't need legislation to build more houses or to, spend money on certain issues which are priorities for voters.
Well, the government is continuing to function, but the major new bills just can't go through Parliament. So everything that we want to do was gridlocked by the fact that people were continually dealing with Brexit. It was a paralysed Parliament. That's why we have to have the general election. We have to come back, in my view, with a Conservative majority. But what we do need is a majority government who can get on with government.
Right now, let's turn our attention, though, to what is on the front pages of pretty much every paper today, and that's Prince Andrew quitting royal duties last night. Some are saying he's asked the Queen's permission. His formal statement said that I have asked Her Majesty if I may step back from public duties for the foreseeable future, and she has given her permission. I think in reality we know he was pushed rather than jumping, but the action was rather decisive after the fallout from the Duke's disastrous TV interview about his friendship with the paedophile billionaire Jeffrey Epstein continued to lead to front page after front page, day after day, of disastrous headlines for the royal family. Well, let's talk to royal biographer Angela Levin about this again. Good morning to you, Angela.
Good morning.
Well, we've discussed this ever since it first came out, this story. Again, those front pages weren't stopping, were there? More and more revelations. Pretty much everything that Prince Andrew said in that interview on Saturday night seemed to be unravelling, there seemed to be a photographic proof of virtually everything that he'd said to be untrue. He's now changed his tune on quite a lot of big issues that came out of that. First of all, he's for once now expressed sympathy for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. He's also said he would cooperate with the police. That was something he didn't say on Saturday. He said he'd talk to lawyers. But also he now says he does regret that friendship, which he was specifically asked about on Saturday and said he didn't. This is a big volte-face, isn't it? But too little, too late.
Yes, it's much too little and much too late. And it also shows how arrogant and thoughtless and not very bright he is, to have gone through that interview and said all those things and come back. And apparently he was heard telling the Queen, mission accomplished. He was delighted. Afterwards he took the whole crew round and showed them lots of things in Buckingham Palace. He was very, very pleased with himself. Reality hasn't sunk in, but he actually has been told what to do, like you tell a naughty boy. Now you must go and apologise, and you've got to say this, and you've got to say that. So that's what he's done. But I think he must be completely baffled because he thought he did such a wonderful job.
And that shows just how out of touch he is. And we know, of course, that his PR man chose to leave his work after just a few months in the job because of this. I mean, again, clearly showing the right decision that he'd made. But this is it. Because this isn't just about Prince Andrew, who everyone says he's stepping back from royal duties and public duties. He'd already stepped back a long time ago from being a formal UK trade envoy. I think most of us pretty unaware of what Prince Andrew does on a daily basis, cutting a few ribbons, patron of a few charities. No charity wants to be associated with him now. No big business wants to be associated with him. So in a way, there wasn't a choice. He wasn't going to be invited to anything anymore. But the reality is, this does affect the firm, as Diana called it, doesn't it? It just does affect the royal family because this is a man who is, the second son of the Queen. He did have a formal role, and yet he's consorting with some very unsavoury characters. His security people would have been with him. It was well documented where he was at any given time. And it appears that no one raised an eyebrow and said, maybe had a quiet word in security circles to the Queen's staff and said, we think that Prince Andrew needs to stop spending time with someone who's a convicted paedophile or a suspected paedophile. And yet nothing happened. It does show that actually the Queen is perhaps not as tight, controlling the firm as tightly as perhaps many thought she used to do.
Well, I know for a fact that the police protection officers feel very strongly that it's not their job to spy on people and to go back and say something. It's their job to protect. And they did this with Prince Harry as well. Not least because they think if the royal denies what they're saying, they'll lose their jobs. So you can't necessarily expect that. But he has been a very difficult member of the royal family, and he has affected the firm. And the Queen, as we all know, is fantastic about her sense of duty, and being the monarch and looking after the people is number one priority. And one of the things is that when a general election is coming up, that the royals sort of keep her back, stand right back. They don't do anything that could be controversial. And of course, she must have been shocked and horrified to hear Boris Johnson and Corbyn talking about the monarchy and what might happen and what they feel about Prince Andrew. It would be absolutely a nightmare for her. And I think Prince Charles, who doesn't think much of his brother and never has done, there would have been this conversation. There was this conversation back and forth across the waves. I mean, I don't know who stayed up all night to do that, because times are tipsy-turvy, but and it was decided that it was impossible for him to do that, and was bringing the whole monarchy into disrepute. And I have a feeling, I've got no evidence, that this is also a warning sign to anyone else who feels that they don't appreciate all the good things about being in the royal family.
Yes.
They don't want to be in the royal family, to pull their socks up.
Well, there is that as well. I mean, again, because this isn't just about this one particular friendship relationship, is it? Because we know that Prince Andrew has been consorting with some other rather unsavoury characters. I would argue Prince Charles does as well, various, Saudi princes and the like. That there is a feeling that, unlike the Queen, who appears to have really very little interest in money, easy to do that when you own that many castles, I imagine, but that actually, especially the younger royals as well, they spend a lot of time around very, very, very rich people, very out of touch, getting, lecturing people like the Harry and Meghan did, within days of about not flying and looking after the environment. When you're getting Elton John's private jet to go away for the weekend, £350,000 baby showers and the like abroad. There is an element where, although there's much support for the Queen, that there is a view that a lot of the younger royals, and I mean every generation down from her, frankly, are living a playboy lifestyle, out of touch from everybody else, but wanting to have the adoration that the Queen gets. And I'm not entirely sure the British public is willing to play ball anymore.
There is a very narrow but very firm line between being a royal and being a celebrity. As a celebrity, this is what Prince Harry told me, you can choose when you have publicity and when you don't. When you're a royal, you're always aware that publicity is around you, and you have to behave in a certain way. I'm actually a huge fan of Prince Charles, and I don't think he's like that. I think he might meet with a lot of very rich people, but he pours it all back into the community. I think he's much undervalued. He, like the Queen, has this enormous sense of duty, and I think maybe some of the others feel a bit more resentful about the things they can't do, rather than looking and appreciating
looking around the palace where they live. Yeah, exactly. Right now, though, let's turn our attention to the manifesto launch, not today by Labour, or next week by the Tories, we understand, but the Liberal Democrats, who had their big announcement yesterday. We're joined now by the Liberal Democrat Brexit spokesman, Tom Brake. Good morning to you, Tom.
Good morning, Julia.
Good morning. Well, you had your launch in North London. I think there were confetti cannons and bright lights. It all looked very, very glamorous, rather than very unlike a party political launch, I think, but very enjoyable for the people there. You also had a huge amount of announcements to make as part of your manifesto, because you've got an awful lot of money to spend. £50 billion you're saying you've got to spend, which other parties wouldn't have to spend because of what you call your Remain bonus. First of all, where are you getting that money from, and then tell us how you're going to spend it?
Okay. Well, the good news is that Paul Johnson from the IFS, who has looked at our plans in relation to a £50 billion bonus over 5 years if we don't leave the European Union, has confirmed that, in his view, that is a conservative estimate. In other words, that money, possibly more, will be available. And the explanation for that is simply the prediction that the UK economy will grow at a slightly greater rate, just under 2%, if we stay in the European Union. So that's where the 50 billion comes from. And how we're going to spend it, well, that's a mixture of things. But, for instance, as well as the income tax increase for health, we will be spending that on childcare. We'll be spending it on green issues. We'll be spending it on improving social care, but with a particular focus on in effect, investing in the future, and that is things like childcare, which will be the biggest sort of item for us.
So, I mean, again, also £10 billion for schools, 20,000 more teachers we were discussing on the show yesterday. It's a lot of money. And again, I've spoken to the Institute of Physical Studies about that £50 billion based on a higher rate of growth. But of course, we've had a lot of predictions about growth in recent years, either good or bad. And the one thing we can say that's very consistent is they've never been right.
Well, I disagree. If you look at the predictions that were made prior to the referendum vote, for instance, whilst it's true that the short-term predictions that were made weren't particularly accurate, in fact, the longer-term predictions, in other words, what happened 3 or 4 years after the event, were pretty accurate in terms of the slowing down of the UK economy. So yes, it's true that this is a prediction, but of course that is true of all the party political manifestos. They're all predicting what is going to happen in the future, because we're investing in the future, and the plans are at the least over a 5-year period. But in relation to things like climate change, so halving emissions, that is something that we're seeking to do over a 10-year period. So yes, we have to make projections.
I mean, this is a difficulty, isn't it? And when we talk about sort of extra £50 billion, I mean, lots of politicians do this at the moment. We always have these figures given out in lump sums. So it sounds like a lot more money than it is. But actually, I mean, of course, I've realised that as it grows, it wouldn't be £10 billion each year. It would be a different figure each year. But in the big scheme of things, in terms of overall government spending, it's not that big a sum, is it?
Well, you're right, Julia. In terms of how much the UK economy or how much tax is raised each year, it's as a relatively small sum. But then if you look at what it can buy, so you refer to the 20,000 extra teachers, a programme to invest in schools, which are in many cases very, very short of investments, so £7 billion for schools, a £10 billion hospital programme, and the childcare investment, which is a £14 billion investment to provide every sort of working parent who has a child who's 9 months or older 35 hours free childcare. That would be hugely beneficial. I don't know, certainly when my children were young, the cost of childcare was absolutely phenomenal, and many families have to make the decision about whether one of the parents has to stay at home, because that's more cost effective than sending a child into childcare, and that's got to be addressed.
But again, our childcare costs are way, way more than most other European countries, partly because of all the extra regulation, which doesn't actually appear to make children prosper any better in that childcare. It's just a lot of form filling. I mean, that's what's been the problem. Are we going to sort that out?
Well, I'm not aware that was a major problem.
I can assure you, having investigated this and spoken about this with experts on the radio for quite a few years, that is exactly what the problem is. Our childcare costs in this country are off the scale compared to any other Western European country.
Well, I think what you're highlighting, of course, is that other Western European countries tend to subsidise their childcare much more than we do, and that is the purpose of our policy, to actually provide free childcare for children 9 months or older.
Would it need to be subsidised by taxpayers if we could actually just take away some of the unnecessary costs, I suppose, with the question? And can we also ask you about some of the other facts that have come up in this election? We saw, of course, that head-to-head debate between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson. It came out with a bit of a score draw. I think the view really was the real winners were those who didn't end up watching the debate in terms of how scrappy it was, 30 seconds sound bites and the like. But there's been some polling which suggests that actually Jo Swinson, although you actually launched a court effort to try and actually get her involved in that debate on the basis that she shouldn't have been left out as a major party leader, that actually she might have lucked out by not being there, because the polling suggests now that actually the more voters see of Jo Swinson, the less they like her. And yet there it is. She is at the front of the campaign. She's face all over the side of your battle bus. Your manifesto, one of the pages, just a full-page picture of Jo Swinson. Are you perhaps putting too much faith in the appeal of your young female leader over actually what her appeal does appear to be to ordinary voters?
No, I don't think so. The polling also suggests that Jo Swinson is far more popular amongst Conservative supporters who voted Remain than Boris Johnson is. I think the fact is that any leader whose prominence and the awareness of the leader grows, clearly people start to take a stronger position, and clearly people who voted Remain are, the more they see of Jo, the more they love her, and people who didn't vote Remain and are strong Brexiteers, it's perhaps not very surprising that they're not particularly enthusiastic about her as our leader.
So for you, obviously you've got a whole range of policies in your manifesto, but for you, particularly because you're your party's Brexit spokesman, this is the Brexit election, as the Tories are billing it themselves, the Brexit Party and yourselves, Labour Party, not so much, Green Party saying it's a green election. But for you, this is going to be first and foremost, first thing, last thing, the Brexit election.
Well, yes, and for us, clearly, it's about stopping Brexit, very clear policy compared to Jeremy Corbyn's policy, but it's also about using the money that we save from not doing a disastrous Brexit to actually invest in the future, things like childcare, things like tackling climate change. I think that is what people want. They want the country to be able to focus on those issues rather than having potentially another 5, 6 or 7 years of distraction over Brexit, which if Boris Johnson gets his deal through, a deal which incidentally puts a border in the Irish Sea, means that we are going to be discussing Brexit for at least 5, 6 or 7 years as the UK seeks to negotiate a new and worse deal in terms of our relationship with the European Union.
Right, now they turn our attention to the subject on pretty much every single front page today. And that is Prince Andrew stepping back from his public duties. Why has he done that? Well, after the embarrassment over the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, and not only his failure to put a dampener on speculation about his relationship with the paedophile billionaire who was already convicted of crimes of child trafficking some years ago. Prince Andrew maintained that friendship with him for years, even went to stay at his house at the time that he knew he was a convicted paedophile and child trafficker. And he also is facing allegations that are made by a woman who was then 17 years old, Virginia Roberts. She claims that at that time she, on 3 occasions, had sex with Prince Andrew while she was being trafficked and was forced to do so by Jeffrey Epstein. Of course, Prince Andrew has denied any wrongdoing there. But after his interview with Emily Maitlis on Saturday night, absolute disaster of an interview. The headlines continued to date, the 6th day in a row when he's been on the front page of most newspapers, with many of the things that he's claimed in that interview being proven with photographic evidence. It was felt that it was time for him to stand down. So after about 6 p.m. last night, the Buckingham Palace put out a statement on behalf of Prince Andrew saying, "I have asked Her Majesty if I may step back from public duties for the foreseeable future, and she has given her permission." Now, it is totally unprecedented for a senior royal to be asked to stand down in this way. There's no doubt that this was a decision by the Queen and indeed Prince Charles, who's currently touring New Zealand. But this is after the Queen was summoned Prince Andrew to Buckingham Palace to tell him that as 8th in line to the throne, he was no longer able to carry out public royal duties. Well, let's talk to Victoria Murphy about this. He's a royal commentator and author and joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. I mean, this is so much more than a he said, she said, a bit of embarrassment for the royals, or the normal stories we get for an annus horribilis for the Queen, where it's a royal affair or a divorce. This is an allegation of serious wrongdoing and serious misjudgment by Prince Andrew, and a lot of concern that we're talking about a royal family completely out of touch with not just ordinary people, but ordinary, I suppose, moral sensibilities in terms of his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. How serious and damaging do you think this story has been, first off, for Prince Andrew himself, but also for the royal family as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as you say, it's an absolutely huge disaster. I think the point at which it really became apparent that he had to step down was when the charities started to come forward and say that they potentially didn't want to have anything to do with him. They wanted to get rid of him as patron. They wouldn't back his projects. And I think it's impossible to sort of overstate how big a deal that is, really. We so rarely hear people speak out criticising the royal family, let alone the charities that they represent. I can't really recall that ever happening before. So once they started to stick their necks out and actually say that they didn't want to work with him, it's totally unsustainable for him to continue in a public role. And I think that the Queen has a very astute sense of how the monarchy is perceived and how that matters. And I think that is why we've seen this decision being made. It's hugely damaging for Andrew. I mean, what he needed to do in that interview, which was a very risky decision to give, was he needed to come out and he needed to unequivocally leave no doubt in anyone's mind that he had any questions left to answer. And he also, crucially, needed to completely distance himself from Jeffrey Epstein and from Jeffrey Epstein's actions. And not only did he neglect to express sympathy for Epstein's victims, which was a glaring omission.
And even when given the opportunity at the end of the interview, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, exactly. And he also said categorically that he didn't regret the friendship. It was completely misjudged. And his response to things like, why did you stay with Epstein? I mean, he needed to either give, this was when Epstein had been released from prison following his conviction, he needed to give such a strong answer as to why that would be justifiable. I mean, I can't really think of one, but if he had one, he needed to put that forward in a way that would leave.
And he just did. And again, he veered wildly between, I barely knew the guy, I knew him through, he was a +1 with my friend Ghislaine Maxwell, and the fact that he'd been on his private jet many times. He'd stayed at his Caribbean island 4 times. He'd gone to stay with him for 4 days. I think he claimed at one point he stayed with the High Consul in New York, who of course has come out today and said, don't have a record of you staying on that date. And again, the whole thing is just, to me, what is smacked of is not only that Prince Andrew's just not a very bright man, but he's also stupid enough not to actually take advice from his advisors. He obviously has never faced proper scrutiny. And this is, I think, a very big issue with our royal correspondents, that these people are given, whether you're a monarchist or a Republican, these people are given very soft soaping. In terms of your public figure, you should be, eligible to answer reasonable lines of questioning. He obviously thought that no one would question anything that he said, and virtually everything he said about where he was, whether he sweats, what he wears, whether he knows someone or not. The photographic and documentary evidence has been produced since to show that he was lying, which suggests that, well, there are going to be question marks about his honesty over the key issue of whether or not he did or did not meet Virginia Roberts, and whether or not, as she has claimed, and he has vehemently denied, that she was forced to have sex with him. Not forced by Prince Andrew, but nevertheless, Jeffrey Epstein had trafficked her and have basically told her, you have to have sex with Prince Andrew. Again, have to stress, he has vehemently denied this. Crucial aspect here, though, is, of course, we know the FBI have got 100 people who've come forward claiming to be victims of Jeffrey Epstein when they were young girls, some as young as 13, 14, 15. Very different situation there from a 17-year-old in this country, certainly. But also that there is an FBI investigation. More and more people are coming forward. Now the damage has been done. People are almost throwing Prince Andrew to the wolves. There's a big question mark over the royal family's security detail and their press and spin operation, and indeed the Queen's advisors, that this hadn't been flagged up earlier. This is not a new story. This has been going on for a long time. The links, there have been formal statements about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein for a long time. Did no one in the royal family, do you think, sort of say, seriously, you need to disappear over this issue? You need to have no contact with this person. And yet he continued to have contact.
Yeah, exactly. It was completely misjudged, and the fact that in the interview he didn't really outright express real regret over that, sincere regret. He has done now in the statement. I thought the tone of this statement was markedly different to the tone of everything else that he's released since previously. He released statements about this earlier on this year, when Epstein was rearrested in the summer, but they failed to kind of shut down the questions against him, and I think that's what he hoped that this interview would do. This has been rumbling on for a very long time, as you say, since 2011, when it emerged that he had met with Epstein in 2010, and also when that photograph was first produced and published by the Mail on Sunday in 2011. That was a really damaging moment for him, and it hasn't really gone away since. This is it kind of coming to a head. And as you say, there is an active investigation into Epstein still. A judge in the US has made it very clear that his victims will have justice, and the fact that he has died, the fact that he died by suicide, does not affect the fact that they're investigating.
Yeah.
And the question is whether or not they will speak to Andrew. It seems likely.
I mean, that would be absolutely extraordinary, wouldn't it?
He has said much more unequivocally in this statement that he is very willing to speak with them. In the interview, I felt that he talked a lot about legal advice.
Yes, he would take legal advice about it, yes.
Yeah, he didn't say it as directly as he has done in this statement. He was offering himself up very much to have a conversation with them in this statement. And as you say, things like the logs of his personal protection officers are things that are going to be discussed. Presumably, there is documentation there of where they were, and that's something that will come up. Now, as someone who's covered the Royals for a long time, it's very difficult for journalists to get, impossible really, get that information, because you go to the Met Police and say, can you tell me something about royal protection? And they say absolutely not, and that's the end of it really. There's no other way to get this information. So potentially an investigation by the authorities is the only route by which
we're going to find anything out. It's
exactly.
going to. I mean, I have to say, I have a funny feeling that this is not going to leave the front pages for some time. Right now, though, let's talk to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sajid Javid, for the Conservatives, who joins us. Good morning to you, Mr. Javid.
Good morning.
Right, big policy announcement today. Of course, Labour manifesto today as well. But in terms of the major policy announcements from the Conservatives, we've got this pledge on social care and on the national insurance threshold. Let's talk about national insurance threshold. But it sounds like it was a policy announcement that wasn't supposed to be announced quite yet, slipped out by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, talking about raising the threshold to £12,500. Can I ask, is that a pledge, or is that just an ambition?
Well, it's a bit of both, in that what we are saying is that we want to continue to cut taxes for hardworking people, and that's what we've done in the last 9 years in office, and we want to take that further by cutting the national insurance contributions that people make. And to be more specific, in the first year of a Conservative majority government, so if we're re-elected, we will raise the threshold from where it currently is at £8,632 to £9,500. And that would be a saving in that year of just under £100 for about 30 million people. And our ambition is to keep raising that threshold and therefore keep cutting what you pay by taking it to £12,500, and when we eventually get there, that will be a saving of just under £500 per person.
And when will we eventually get there? Is that something you're going to deliver at the end of, say, 4 or 5 years?
Well, you know,
or is it still just something you hope to do?
Well, we will do it, and I would love to say it's 4 or 5 years and things, but we're also, as Conservatives, we also take our responsibility very seriously for managing the nation's finances, and we will do it as we can afford it. So what will happen is that each budget we will try to take it further and try to get as close as we can, as quickly as we can, to that ambition. And can I say that this is how we approached the cut in income tax, a huge cut in income tax that we provided for working people, where we've doubled that threshold from around £6,000 to over £12,000, and that has meant that for the average person on income tax, they're already paying £1,000 less than they would have done otherwise. So it's how we did it with income tax, it's how we're going to do it with national insurance, and it underlines once again that it's the Conservative Party that is the party of working people.
But after years of austerity, you know as well as I do that actually these taxes aren't particularly progressive, because the more you earn up to a certain point, you're going to benefit more from those thresholds going up than people at the very bottom.
Well, this is a flat cash saving for everyone. So with the saving of when we take it to 9,500, it's a flat cash saving, and that means that those on the lowest incomes will benefit the most. And also, this is not about benefiting perhaps, let's say, those that have dividend income or they own lots of properties and things like that. This is specifically on the way that most of us earn our money, which is a hard day's work and the salary we get in return, and how we can help you keep more of that money. And of course, this is alongside so many other things that we've done and we continue to build on if we're re-elected. So, for example, the national living wage, which is already meant for someone working full hours, that's a £2,750 extra they're earning. We're going to increase that over the next few years. We had a fuel duty freeze in place for 9 years. We've cut stamp duty for 95% of people. You know, all of this is the kind of values. It represents the values that we have as Conservatives, as being the party of hard-working people.
And also, you're saying that also the party of tax cuts, and Boris Johnson, when he was running for the Tory leadership, talked a lot about tax cuts as well. But you're also announcing today a social care pledge.
Yeah.
Again, still intrigued by the difference between a pledge and an ambition, but a £5 billion cash injection to ease the funding crisis to pay for social care. Now, this is something that politicians and journalists and ordinary people have been talking about for, goodness me, over a decade or more now, and yet nothing has been done. We know in 2017, Theresa May's manifesto sort of crashed and burned over the issue of became dubbed the dementia tax. If you want to end the injustice of people having to sell their family home in order to pay for their social care if they have dementia, someone's got to pay for it. And if the government's paying for it, it's paid for out of taxes. So you'll have to increase taxes to do that, won't you?
Well, what we want is everyone to have access to the best quality care that they can possibly have, and to have that sort of dignity and compassion in old age. And that's our plan, and that's our sort of 3-point plan we set out today, which is, first of all, extra money for the current system, because it's not going to change overnight, and we're promising the extra billion that's required each year for the current system. Secondly, it's about getting a consensus between the major political parties on what the new system should look like. And why do we want that? Because something you've just said, actually, you've touched on, which is this debate about social care and what the system should look like has been going on for years and years under successive governments. And I think, rather like our NHS, where there's an agreement with all the major parties that the NHS is special and that it should be free at the point of use, that everyone agrees on the basic principles, people know that they can rely on it no matter which party is in power. And we need that kind of long-term certainty for something as important as social care. So that's why we're going to try and reach that consensus. And the other thing is that we will guarantee, though, as the third point of our plan, that no individual in that new system would have to sell their home in order to meet the costs of social care. Why are we doing that? We just think it's the right thing to do. You know, people work incredibly hard. The home is often their biggest asset that they have, and they rightly want to pass that on to their loved ones and think it's going to be an asset for their family for the future. And I think that's morally right, and that we will guarantee that in the new system.
OK, also, just finally, I know we've only got a very short time with you. You've got a very, very busy media round this morning. But Prince Andrew, of course, he's actually dominating the front pages today, far more than political stories. That he's announced that he's stepping back from public duties. He's now expressed remorse for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein and said he will cooperate with the police. Is this too little, too late?
Well, first of all, my thoughts are with those victims, and sadly it sounds like many victims of Mr. Epstein. And everyone, whether it's Prince Andrew or anyone else, anyone that thinks that they might be able to help with bringing some help to those victims by ending some of their suffering, then they should obviously come forward and provide that assistance. And reading that statement yesterday by the Prince, it sounds like that's exactly what he's doing. I think it was the right course of action, and it's good that he's happy to cooperate with any law enforcement authority. I think that's just the right thing to do.